The Mukden Incident and Manchuria Invasion, 1931. In 1931, Japan started a war using a bomb they planted themselves. At the time, Japan wanted Manchuria, a resource-rich region in northeast China, but invading outright would make them look like the aggressor, so they needed an excuse. On September 18, 1931, Japanese soldiers blew up a small section of railway near Mukden, a railway they already controlled. The damage was so minor, trains still ran, but Japan blamed China anyway. Within hours, Japanese troops launched a full invasion of Manchuria. Cities fell fast, civilians were killed, villages were burned. Japan then created a fake state called Manchukuo, ruled by a puppet emperor. The League of Nations investigated and ruled Japan guilty. Japan's response? They walked out of the League. The Mukden incident showed the world that aggression could go unpunished, and it paved the road straight to World War II. Before we continue, if you're into wartime stories, major historical events, and the dark side of history, please do well to subscribe and click on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our uploads. And if you find value at the end, please make sure to like the video because it really helps with YouTube's crazy algorithm these days. Also, let me know any dark historical events you'll like me to cover on this channel. Let's get into it. Establishment of Unit 731, 1932 to 1945. In 1932, the Imperial Japanese Army established Unit 731. Its mission? Develop biological and chemical weapons for total war. Test subjects were prisoners of war and civilians. They were classified as logs, and their names were unnecessary to the Japanese. Humans were infected with plague, cholera, and anthrax. Organs were removed without anesthesia to measure decay in real time. Limbs were frozen, shattered, and amputated to study shock and survival. Unit 731 tested weapons on entire populations. Diseases were released into villages. Water supplies were poisoned. Death was just data to them. By 1945, thousands were dead. No trials, no justice, only results, traded for immunity. This war was engineered. Nanjing Massacre, 1937 to 1938. In December 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army captured the Chinese capital, Nanjing. What followed was not a battle, but one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. For 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers unleashed mass violence on civilians and surrendered Chinese troops. Historians estimate 200,000 to 300,000 people were killed. Men were executed in mass shootings. Women, tens of thousands, were groped, raped, and many were then murdered. Children and the elderly were not spared. There was no mercy for any non-Japanese. Bodies were dumped into rivers. Entire families were wiped out. The city burned. Foreign diplomats and missionaries documented the crimes in real time. Their photos, diaries, and reports still exist today. Yet for decades, the massacre was denied or minimized by some. The Nanjing Massacre wasn't an accident of war. It was systematic brutality. Remembering it isn't about revenge. It's about truth, justice, and making sure history never repeats itself. The Shanghai Massacre, 1937. Shanghai today is one of the most beautiful and well-developed cities in the world. But in 1937, before Hiroshima, before Pearl Harbor, Japan committed one of its least talked about war crimes, the Shanghai Massacre. After months of brutal fighting, Japanese forces captured Shanghai during the Second Sino-Japanese War. What followed wasn't just occupation, it was terror. Japanese troops carried out mass executions of Chinese soldiers who had already surrendered. along with civilians accused of resistance. Many were shot, bayoneted, or buried alive. Entire neighborhoods were looted and burned. Civilians were targeted deliberately. Men were lined up and executed. Women were raped. Families were destroyed in days. Thousands died. Exact numbers remain unknown because bodies were dumped or burned. The Shanghai Massacre set the stage for even worse atrocities, including the Nanjing Massacre weeks later. It showed a clear pattern. Violence wasn't accidental, it was policy. In 1937, the world had already banned chemical weapons, but in China, Japan used them anyway. Between 1937 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army deployed mustard gas, lewisite, and choking agents against Chinese soldiers and civilians. These weren't accidents. They were authorized at the highest military levels, including approval from top commanders. Villages were shelled with poison gas. Soldiers were blinded, burned alive from the inside, or suffocated slowly. Farmers and children were caught in contaminated fields with no warning and no protection. Japan used chemical weapons hundreds of times, especially when conventional weapons failed or when they wanted to crush resistance quickly. The effects didn't end when the war ended. Unexploded chemical munitions still poison Chinese soil today, killing and injuring civilians decades later. This was a clear violation of international law, yet for years it was barely talked about. Massacres in other Chinese cities. When people talk about Japan's war crimes in China, they usually mention Nanjing. But Nanjing was not an exception. It was part of a pattern. Between 1937 and 1945, Japanese forces carried out massacres in dozens of Chinese cities, many of which are rarely discussed today. In Shanghai, thousands of civilians were executed after the city fell in 1937. In Wuhan, mass killings followed Japan's capture of the city, with entire neighborhoods burned. In Changsha and Canton, civilians were shot, villages destroyed, and prisoners executed without trial. Japanese troops often used kill all, burn all, loot all tactics, wiping out towns suspected of helping resistance forces. These were not battlefield accidents. Civilians were deliberately targeted: men, women, and children. Historians estimate that millions of Chinese civilians died across these cities, outside of Nanjing alone. These massacres are a reminder that the war in Asia was already brutally devastating, long before atomic bombs were dropped. Sexual slavery/comfort women, 1937 to 1945. Between 1937 and 1945, tens of thousands of women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied countries were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. They are known as the comfort women. These women, some as young as 12, some even younger, were taken from their homes, deceived with promises of work, or outright kidnapped. Once in military comfort stations, they endured unimaginable abuse, often being raped multiple times a day, under threat of death. The trauma was not only physical. Many survivors suffered lifelong psychological scars, social stigma, and the erasure of their stories for decades. Despite international outcry, Japan officially apologized only decades later. These women's voices remind us: war crimes leave scars that last generations. Bataan Death March, April 1942. In April 1942, after months of brutal fighting in the Philippines, 75,000 Filipino and American troops surrendered to the Japanese army. What followed became one of the darkest chapters of World War II, the Bataan Death March. Prisoners were forced to march 65 miles under the scorching sun, with almost no food, water, or medical care. Those who stumbled or tried to escape were shot or bayoneted on the spot. Thousands died from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. Estimates suggest about 10,000 to 12,000 Filipino and American men perished during the march. Survivors were sent to brutal prison camps to face further abuse. The Bataan Death March stands as a stark reminder of the human cost of war and the courage of soldiers who endured unimaginable suffering. Hell Ships Transport of POWs, 1942 to 1945. During World War II, tens of thousands of Allied prisoners of war faced a nightmare worse than the battlefield, aboard Japan's infamous Hell Ships. From 1942 to 1945, POWs captured in the Philippines, Singapore, and other territories were crammed into cargo ships, sealed like sardines in suffocating holds. Disease, starvation, and dehydration were constant killers. There were no toilets, barely any food or water, and ventilation was almost non-existent. Thousands died before even reaching their forced labor destinations in Japan, Korea, or Southeast Asia. To make matters worse, many of these ships were unmarked. Allied planes, unaware POWs were aboard, bombed and sank them, turning tragedy into catastrophe.
Construction of the Burma-Thailand Death Railway, 1942 to 1943.
In 1942, the Japanese military embarked on one of World War II's deadliest construction projects, the Burma-Thailand Death Railway. Over 60,000 Allied prisoners of war and hundreds of thousands of Asian laborers were forced to build a 415-kilometer railway through the jungle, mountains, and swamps under brutal conditions. Workers faced starvation, disease, and exhaustion with minimal tools and shelter. Malaria, cholera, and dysentery claimed thousands.
Beatings and executions were common for those who faltered. Every day, men died from sheer exhaustion, hunger, or abuse. Over 12,000 Allied POWs and tens of thousands of laborers perished. The railway was meant to supply Japanese forces in Burma, but it came at a staggering human cost, forever earning its grim name, the Death Railway. Mass executions and atrocities in the Philippines, 1942 to 1945. Between 1942 and 1945, the Philippines suffered some of the worst atrocities of World War II, at the hands of the Japanese Imperial Army. After invading the islands, Japanese forces carried out mass executions of civilians and suspected guerrilla fighters. Entire villages were destroyed, and families were often forced to witness the killings of their loved ones. Some victims were executed publicly, meant to intimidate anyone who resisted. Others were tortured or starved in makeshift prisons. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of Filipinos were killed by the Japanese in these brutal campaigns. In Manila alone, during the Japanese retreat in 1945, roughly 100,000 civilians were massacred. Homes, schools, and hospitals were destroyed in a desperate attempt to slow the advancing Allied forces. These dark years left scars that still haunt the Philippines today, a grim reminder of the human cost of war. Occupation atrocities in Singapore and Malaya, 1942 to 1945. In February 1942, Singapore, called the Gibraltar of the East, fell to Japanese forces in just 72 hours. What followed was a brutal occupation that would haunt the region for years. Under Japanese rule, civilians and prisoners of war faced systematic atrocities. Public executions, torture, and mass beatings became a daily reality. Suspected resistance fighters were summarily executed, while entire villages were terrorized to crush dissent. Tens of thousands were subjected to forced labor, building railways, airfields, and military installations under deadly conditions. Starvation, disease, and abuse were rampant, claiming countless lives. By the time the occupation ended in 1945, Singapore and Malaya had endured years of fear, suffering, and loss. The dark chapter of Singapore and Malaya's occupation reminds us, history must be remembered, so its lessons are never repeated.
Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, Atrocities, 1942 to 1945. During World War II, the Japanese occupation of the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia, was marked by extreme brutality. From 1942 to 1945, millions of civilians and prisoners faced unimaginable suffering. Japanese forces targeted political prisoners, intellectuals, and suspected resistance members. Thousands were tortured or executed, often in public, as a warning to others. Civilians and captured soldiers were forced into harsh labor on plantations, mines, and construction projects. Starvation, disease, and brutal treatment claimed countless lives. Entire villages were burned or looted, leaving families homeless and starving. Cultural sites and religious artifacts were destroyed, erasing centuries of heritage. These atrocities left a deep scar on Indonesia's history, contributing to the widespread suffering and loss of life during the war. The use of civilians as human shields. During World War II, Japanese forces didn't just fight soldiers, they often used civilians as human shields to protect their military objectives. In battles across China, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, civilians were forced to march ahead of troops, stand in front of tanks, or shield bunkers from enemy fire. This tactic wasn't just cruel, it was deadly. Thousands of men, women, and children were killed, not by accident, but deliberately, as Japanese commanders prioritized military advantage over human life. This strategy violated every rule of war. The Geneva Conventions, which protect civilians, were ignored. Survivors often witnessed unspeakable horrors. Entire villages destroyed, families lost, and communities terrorized. The execution of prisoners for propaganda or intimidation. In occupied China, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia, Japanese forces would publicly execute captured soldiers and civilians. These weren't secret killings. They were designed to instill fear and break resistance. Prisoners were sometimes tied up, paraded through villages, or displayed in public squares before execution. The message was clear. Defiance would be met with death. Entire communities were forced to witness these atrocities. The psychological impact was devastating. Coercion, submission, and terror became weapons as lethal as guns. Historians estimate thousands of such executions occurred across Asia before 1945. These acts weren't just war crimes. They were deliberate tools of intimidation, leaving scars on generations. Subscribe and comment Japanese if you'd want to see a part 2 of this series.